I'm sure you've already heard about prohibition in the US, but did you know that the UK once had its own form of prohibition? One which was brought on by a very particular drink. If you took a walk through 18th century London, you might well stumble upon quite a strange interaction. An adult man walking up to a closed door with a picture of a cat on it, who would suddenly cry out the word "puss." The answer, which would come from inside, another man's voice, meowing. An exchange of money and something else would then typically take place. The main thing was to keep the seller's identity a secret. The person inside the building would never reveal their identity throughout. The reason for this, you've probably guessed, this exchange was deeply illegal. So, what is it that you, having just stepped out of your time machine, have just witnessed? What you've just seen is a purchase. Something called partiality has just been sold. You don't know what partiality is? Oh, what about Max? No? Flashes of lightning? South Sea Mountain? Old Tom, maybe? Well, what if I told you that all of these words relate to what is often seen as one of the most British of drinks? Something so profoundly connected to the UK that it couldn't possibly come from, say, the Dutch, for example. What the 18th century time-travelling version of you has just witnessed is, in a way, an old-fashioned drug deal. But what was the product? At the time, it might have been called Cock My Cap or Kilgreaf, The Last Shift, or even White Satin. Today, it's best known simply as gin. So why were people resorting to cat sounds simply to buy one of the ingredients to a gin and tonic? And how did this simple alcoholic beverage split British society apart in the 18th century, bringing on its own personal prohibition? This is the story of gin, of how it's not actually even British, and of an entire country losing its mind over a drink. 18th century Britain declared war on gin. Why is that? I'm Sebastien Pollock. This episode was researched by Regan Ebsworth. Though this story doesn't exactly paint gin in a very positive light, this podcast is broadcast on French radio, so by law, I have to preface this by saying that gin, and alcohol in general, should always be consumed in moderation. As you'll find out, gin consumed without moderation might well end up tearing your entire country apart, so be careful. But before we get onto that, let's talk about gin in itself. This traditional British beverage, patriotism in a bottle. Today we often think of London gin, and as we do, little Union Jack flags appear in the reflection of our eyeballs as God Save the King plays from somewhere in the distance. But as it turns out, God Save the King is probably the wrong national anthem to be playing. Although gin did come to the UK via a king, William of Orange, also known as William III, this particular king was actually, well, Dutch. It's 1688, and, like many times throughout history, people are very busy arguing over the simple question of who loves Jesus the most. They called it the Glorious Revolution. At the time, King James II was a Catholic king, which Protestant nobles weren't hugely fond of, so they invited our friend Bill of Orange to come and rule in his place, and to depose the sitting king. William was rather chuffed at the idea of getting an invitation to come and rule Britain, so he landed on British shores with a Dutch army, forcing James to flee to France, and a bit like how politicians these days claim to have resigned when everyone knows they've clearly been fired, everyone concluded that King James had abdicated from the throne. In 1689, Parliament jointly offered William of Orange and his English wife Mary the throne under the Declaration of Rights. This was the first time that a King and Queen of England were given joint rule over the country. It also served as a way of curbing power away from the monarchy and transferring it to Parliament at the same time. And it's in Parliament, in fact, that the first bricks were laid for gin to enter the UK. See, spirits weren't all that common at the time, but the Dutch had their own, and William brought it along with him as he claimed the throne, a drink distilled from grain and that used juniper berries. the Dutch word for juniper berries, and this new spirit was Geneva, soon shortened to gin. Brandy, a spirit distilled from wine, was already relatively common among the rich in Britain, but it was very expensive, having to be imported from France. And because the old king had fled to France, William quickly declared war on the country and outlawed all things French and Catholic, including brandy. He also deregulated gin at the same time, taxing it very little and letting basically anyone produce and sell it. And because it was quite easy and cheap to produce, people did. British soldiers took gin to France with them when they went to war. In fact, it's believed that this is likely where we get the expression Dutch courage from. Soldiers using a Dutch beverage to calm down before battle. Because of the gap in the market caused by the outlawing of brandy, more and more people turned to gin. Since it didn't need high-quality grain to be distilled, farmers would provide their leftover harvests, the stuff that wouldn't be good enough for bread, for distilling. And like every new craze, it became very popular very quickly, and people started putting it in basically everything, including medicine. Suddenly, the poor who couldn't afford brandy before now had access to this new beverage. It was cheap to make and easy to flavour. You could put basically anything in it, and soon there were gins of all types, of all potencies and flavours flooding through the streets of London. By the early 1700s, London was incredibly prosperous. And with this new prosperity came a new thrill, an addiction to risk. In 1711, the South Sea Company, which is a body owned partly by the government and partly by private investors, secured exclusive rights to trade in South America. This caused a boom in stock trading as people rushed to buy shares in this new venture. It was nicknamed the South Sea Bubble. And it was also around this time that lotteries started growing in popularity. In 1712, a widow won £20,000 in a lottery, an exorbitant amount of money equivalent to over £3.5 million in today's money, or €4 million. This began to affect the wealth and dynamics of society. Suddenly, poor people were coming into large sums of money. Traditionally rich families would, on the other end, occasionally fall prey to gambling addiction and lose large slices, if not the entirety of their fortunes. This love of risk brought on other things too. Prostitution, for instance, became commercialised. There was even a floating brothel on the Thames called the Folie, moored right in the centre of London, between palaces and expensive residences. People were gambling in casinos, playing with stocks, and throughout all of this, gin grew in popularity. Dram shops, which were kind of the bars of the time, used to have signs up that read, "Drunk for a penny, dead drunk for 2p, straw for nothing." Meaning simply that if you passed out drunk from too much drinking, they'd let you sleep on the straw and wouldn't charge you. But in early 1720, the bubble popped. Share prices on the South Sea Bubble had been skyrocketing, only the year before in fact, but suddenly the whole thing crashed. The result was entire families losing their life savings overnight. London went from being swept by prosperity and a love for risk to suddenly being plagued by bankruptcy. Debtors were ruined and sent to prison, some even taking their own lives as a result. The crash caused public fury to spread across London. Pamphlets and satirical documents were painted, criticising and mocking corrupt directors. Parliament looked into the crash and passed new laws under the Bubble Act. They seized assets and jailed company officials, bringing in stricter corporate regulations and greater financial transparency at the Bank of England. Investors became more cautious. There was no more gambling on stocks. More than a third of banks in London had gone bankrupt and poverty was spreading indiscriminately as even rich men lost much of, if not all of their wealth. As misery spread, London shifted into a new age. An age of excessive drinking, of pain, of misery and of violence. An age which would come to be known as the Gin Panic. As we established earlier, gin had one big advantage in the fact that it was cheap to distill. And as a result of this, it became very commonplace. In 1720, 90% of gin was being brewed in London alone. With the increased poverty, it became people's favourite alcoholic beverage. The result? By 1723, every man, woman and child was consuming the equivalent of an entire pint of gin every single week. So a movement started to form around this time. It ignored growing poverty as a potential cause for the problem and instead started to attack gin directly as the devil's drink, blaming it for the city's struggles. In 1733, a doctor, Stephen Hales, published a paper on the negative effects of gin. Up till now, it hadn't been seen as an unhealthy drink at all. In fact, many people believed gin to have medical and health-improving properties. Remember how I said earlier that they used to put gin in medicine? Well, this new paper, in fact, became the first real account of the harmful effects of spirits on people's health and well-being. A detailed medical argument backed by experiments and by studies. Dr. Hales argued that spirits thickened the blood and narrow blood vessels. He said that they were bad for the liver, that they could cause diseases and brain damage, or negatively affect the heart. He calls them addictive and advises pregnant and breastfeeding women to stop drinking. Because yes, pregnant women didn't stop drinking alcohol around this time. That was completely normal. All of this new information helped to fuel the anti-gin sentiment. But despite this, come the late 1720s, more gin was being drunk in London than ever before. And it's around this time that gin truly entered the political sphere, when the Right Honourable Robert Walpole, a man often regarded as being Britain's first ever Prime Minister, got involved. See, Bob was looking for a way of getting into the King's good books. He planned to do this by increasing the civil list, the budget which covers the Crown's expenses, basically subsidising the monarchy. And so, as is rather standard in the political sphere, when looking for new money, he decided to find something to tax. And that something would be gin. Historians call this the First Gin Act. It was put into law in 1729 and was, by most measures, a complete and utter failure. The law that Walpole instates starts by making it mandatory for gin sellers to get a licence. The thing is, up to now, anybody could make and sell gin. Most small sellers had never been registered and they weren't eager to sign up for new taxes now. So they simply continued to sell gin without a licence. One of the main things which allowed this to happen was the fact that gin wasn't all that easy to define in legal terms. The Act covers spirits with juniper berries in. So in order to circumvent this law, many sellers simply took out the juniper berries and called their gin parliamentary brandy instead. This was enough to make it completely legal to sell without a licence at the time. One of the problems with parliamentary brandy, however, was that it was pure, raw spirit. In fact, it was dangerously strong. It could maim, disable, or even kill its drinker. The whole thing was a huge disappointment to our friend Bob. The Gin Act didn't even produce a fraction of the income that he had expected to see. Gin was as popular as ever, and the king's coffers were just as light. Enter Judith Dufour. In January 1734, Judith was a working-class woman and the mother of a little girl called Mary. Mary, you see, had been a bit of an accident. She was born as the result of a fling. One day, Judith was at work having gin with her colleagues on the job. This was nothing unusual. Her boss had struck a deal with the local dram shop to supply the workhouse with alcohol, so it was all pretty standard. After a couple of pints, though, Judith suddenly announces to her colleagues that she has abandoned her daughter in a field. She said some other woman that she had got drunk with, Suki, had told her to do it. She said it wasn't her fault and that they had tied a handkerchief around the child's neck to stop her crying, stripped her naked and left her in a field in freezing January. After this, they had taken the child's clothes and sold them. They had then used this money to buy themselves more gin. Her colleagues, shocked by this revelation, went out to look for Mary. They found the little girl's body in a ditch, dead. A strip of cloth pulled tightly around her neck. This event became a huge scandal. It was written about extensively in the press, and Judith Dufour was put on trial. She maintained throughout that this woman, Suki, had forced her to do it. The courts found her guilty, and she was publicly hanged. The anti-gin movement soon picked up her story to fuel their rhetoric and used her image as the face of their protests. So by 1936, there came the second Gin Act, a much stricter version of the first. To begin with, the tax was increased by an enormous amount. The excise was 20 shillings per gallon, an enormous tax. For context, that's over £180 in today's money, or 215 euros. But that tax was the least of your worries if you were selling gin at the time, because it could cost you £50 just to acquire a licence. This was more money than the average Londoner made in an entire year. And, to avoid circumventing the licence requirements like before, they redefined gin more broadly. They closed that loophole which allowed people to simply rename it to parliamentary brandy. They also set up heavy fines to persecute those who sold gin illegally. And because gin was mostly consumed by the working class people of London, this act was seen as a prohibition on the poor. It was passed in Parliament near the beginning of the year, with the act set to come into law officially by September. It's at this point that protests start to erupt around London. A couple of months before, on the 14th of July, a bomb went off in Westminster Hall. I say a bomb, it wasn't much of one really. It made a loud bang and caused smoke to go everywhere. It was more of a publicity stunt by two men, Samuel Killingbeck and Robert Nixon. The idea was to highlight injustices, among which the new Gin Act. And it worked. The event swarmed the newspapers. Killingbeck and Nixon were apprehended by the authorities, but it was too late. Violence had started to erupt in London's East End. The whole thing started to make the authorities feel quite uneasy. And so there was a dramatic build-up to the passing of the second Gin Act. The government worried about violence and revolts. Soldiers were called to London in preparation as a show of strength. September rolled around, the Gin Act came into law, and nothing happened. See, people didn't really expect the prohibition to last. There was no flood of applications for the £50 retail licence. In fact, by the winter of 1736, only 2 people sold gin in London legally. Yet thousands were supposedly selling it under the counter. The penalties were harsh, a £100 fine if you were caught selling spirits without a licence. But there was no formal police at this time, so magistrates were given the power to deal with the gin sellers. They were a sort of volunteer law enforcement. They didn't get paid, they had very little equipment, but they were sent around London to catch criminals and issue fines. They could fine people £10 for selling gin in the streets, or sentence them to 2 months of hard labour. Despite this, gin sellers continued to flood London. So, the magistrates began offering up rewards for anyone who informed on a gin seller. The informants could buy themselves some gin and then tell on the person they got it from. In exchange, they would get £5 from the £10 fine the seller would have to pay when they were arrested. £5 was a lot of money at the time, so many people became informants. The problem is, it was too much money. £10 was more than the poorest people earned in an entire year. So all that was achieved from arresting the gin sellers was to fill up the houses of correction. Very few people had the means of paying off the fine and were simply locked up instead. So often, informants didn't get any of the money that they had been promised. It's around this time that our friend Puss from the beginning came about. He was brought along by Captain Dudley Bradstreet. Dudley wasn't new to crime. He was a con man and used his skills to profit from the situation, all of this panic around gin. He bought a sign with a picture of a cat, stuck a lead pipe through it protruding below the cat's paw, and mounted it inside a window. He then put the word out that gin would be sold by the cat at his window the next day. People would walk up to his cat sign, pop 2 pennies through the cat's mouth, which was like the opening to a piggy bank. Bradley would then pour gin through a funnel, which would then flow out from the pipe under the cat's paw. Quite ingenious, really. And by doing this, he could easily sell gin, all the while remaining anonymous. It made it hard for informants to find out who he was, even when they bought gin from him. This idea spread around London. People copied the cat sign, often simplifying the design. It was easier for them to simply put a picture of a cat and use a double drawer. People would simply put money into the drawer, it would be pulled back in, then pushed out again with a small bottle of gin inside it. And so, As this new way of selling gin gained popularity, the authorities became more and more frustrated. By early 1737, the prohibition evolved. To the government, it was no longer about gin. It became something altogether different, a question of control. They had to restore order and reimpose their authority. Because there was no police force at the time, the government relied heavily on these informants. The government started guaranteeing them the £5 reward. Whether the arrested person could pay off their £10 fine or not, the government would pay the informant their share of the money. And money proved to be a strong motivator, with £5 being more than an average year's rent for most people. London became paranoid as people turned against each other and gin sellers were arrested left, right and centre. But an increase in informants also resulted in more and more assaults. People didn't like being snitched on, and so informants were made an example of, often being dragged through the streets or beaten. So the informants started to gang up in order to protect themselves from these mobs, working as a team to root out gin dealers. But soon, with the increased threat of violence, their numbers started to dwindle, with fewer people wanting to risk telling the authorities what they knew. In October, the first informant was killed. He was cornered by a crowd and beaten to death with sticks. His wife and friend tried to help him, but they were also beaten. In November, there were 3 more informant deaths. A riot even broke out at one of their funerals, with the informant's coffin being pelted by an angry mob. The whole gin industry was driven underground as the prohibition tore society apart. Friends were telling on friends. Neighbours were turning on each other, with snitching sometimes even happening from within families themselves. In late January 1738, a full-scale riot broke out in the streets of London. A magistrate's house was mobbed by over 1,000 people as he tried to calm them down by reading them the Riot Act. Eventually, the army came in and dispersed the crowd, arresting the riot's leader, who was taken to court. But the man got himself a very good lawyer, and he got away, scot-free. He became a symbol of the government's impotence in the face of the ever-growing violence stoked by this gin prohibition. The authorities struggled throughout this entire period, with the papers reporting as many as 12,000 convictions, though these numbers are likely to be exaggerated. And rather than halting the spread of gin, the prohibition actually increased its production, with it rising by 28% compared to the previous year. By the end of the year, attempts to enforce the act started to dwindle. The magistrates were fed up. They were tired, they weren't trained to deal with this kind of thing, and they didn't want the danger or hassle of it anymore. They started to turn a blind eye and stopped enforcing the Gin Act in their areas. Despite the government's promise to pay informants, many never even saw the £5 reward. Stories of unpaid informants started to spread in the papers, and with a high risk of being beaten to death, but also a reasonable chance that it might all be for nothing, informant numbers started to dwindle too. It would be another 5 years before the Gin Act was finally repealed in 1743. But by then, any attempts to enforce the Act had already been dropped almost altogether. Around this time, the new Prime Minister, Carteret, needed money to fund a war in Austria. He reduced licences to an affordable rate and eased duties on gin in an attempt to finally make the drink profitable for the government. And it worked. By 1744, more than 1,000 London gin sellers had taken out the new licence, with 20,000 of them taking it out nationwide. The regulations finally started to work. So how did a drink like gin manage to tear a nation apart in this way? Some historians argue that gin was merely a scapegoat. The real problem at the time was poverty. But instead of addressing it head-on, the government took away people's anaesthetic of sorts, blaming gin for the social economic problems of the period instead of seeing it for what it was, a mere symptom of something deeper, a way for people to cope with a desperate situation. There was also the fact that the poor felt discriminated against by the Gin Act. Buying gin quickly became a sort of protest movement. At that time, the rich drank port and smuggled in French brandies, but the poor only had gin, so they felt targeted, and the simple act of buying the drink was a way to show their discontent and to fight back against what they saw as an unfair law. Despite the situation improving, gin would remain a touchy political topic for many years to come, with still more versions of the Gin Act coming to fruition in the following decades. Where there was poverty, there was gin, and where there was gin, there continued to be an argument over how it should be enforced. And so that's the story of how a drink tore 18th century British society apart. Today, gin isn't as much of a divisive topic anymore. It's no longer a protest drink, as far as I know, nor a source of political division. It's simply that thing that your aunt will drink too much of at a party. The Dutch courage that might push you to go onto the dance floor. The most British of drinks, even though it's actually Dutch. Thanks for watching.